climate change and changes in the weather pattern is affecting not only Zimbabwe, the whole Southern Africa region. And frankly, globally, this issue of El Nino effects is really a very sad thing which is happening.
Zimbabwe has gone through a couple of shocks over the recent years and decades. Economic shocks, social shocks, climate change shocks. We all know that the present drought is the worst since 1992.
The statistics that are coming through on climate change show that even if we maintain the same level of support through government systems, through the international community, and productivity can start going up, climate change will reverse all of those positive effects.
In sub-Saharan Africa, in general, we see an increased frequency and intensity of all kinds of crises, disasters, whether floods or droughts or unpredictable weather patterns, let's say, which means that this creates a lot of challenges for the countries involved.
Thousands of animals have died. There is a scarcity of water. So we need to totally change the way we are doing things in this country.
In the specific context of Zimbabwe, that means that we have to build the capacity of the people to prevent disasters where possible, prepare for them, adapt to them where disaster can't be prevented, and try to mitigate the impact of disasters whenever they come. Because one of the major objectives, of course, is to try to avoid people falling into destitution and absolute poverty, and at the same time preserve the assets of the people so that they can start building a better future.
It's about looking for a sustainable solution. It is about addressing poverty. It's about addressing hunger. It's helping people to help themselves. So I would say this is the core of development.
Considering that 60% at least of population lives in rural areas and are facing these different impacts of climate change and whatever other sources of disasters, it's critically important if you have a poverty reduction strategy for a country that you really help people build resilience to these challenges.
It's really very much looking at the ability of people to cope with different shocks that might affect their household systems, their agricultural systems, and the livelihoods that maintains their lives. I think that it's really, in the Zimbabwe context, we're looking at droughts, but in the long term, we're trying to look at resilience that really sort of looks at longer term issues, and the one that really I think is in the forefront of many people's minds at the moment is climate change.
Resilience building means helping people to add on to their strength so they can resist the shocks of vulnerability.
To build resilience, like resilience itself is actually for households themselves to be able to either avoid any of those shocks but also mitigate. Some of them are unavoidable, and to actually be able to mitigate the effects of those shocks. But it's not just at a household level, it's also at a community level, and it's all the way through the system. So making sure that the private sector and markets are resilient to the changes that might occur in the Zimbabwe context.
If you want to minimize humanitarian needs, you have to build resilience, as we said. So you have to focus on malnutrition, you have to focus on poverty, on climate change, on access to health and education, all these things. So what we need is a comprehensive approach to build a real strategy of resilience enhancement in this country.
So we believe Zimbabwe can lift up very easily to be a resilient country through these type of approaches and can be a good gain and return.
And Zimbabwe, luckily now, is at the forefront internationally of resilience thinking, to actually have a large component that really creates information, platforms in transparent ways to share data and knowledge so that others can take forward the learning that this programme has made.
Well, since 2012, in fact, the EU has designed a worldwide program fighting poverty, malnutrition, climate change, and they have developed an action plan for resilience in disaster-prone countries. These we have started translating in the Zimbabwe context.
Zimbabwe has received, rightly, levels of humanitarian funding that really protect lives and livelihoods, and that has been relevant. But I think as money becomes tighter, globally there are many humanitarian crises at the moment, we need to make sure that for every penny of humanitarian funding that it is used appropriately. Most importantly though, global evidence shows that it needs to be predictable as well, it needs to be timely, and it needs to be coordinated. And all the evidence there globally is that that's where you get real value for money, for want of a better term, in humanitarian programming.
After the current phase is done, we have a well-tested approach and mechanism so that resilience is value for money. Resilience is a good investment. And resilience building helps bring sustainability. Resilience building helps to achieve the big goal which the UN and global leaders have set on Sustainable Development Goal.
So what is needed now is to bring all the forces of goodwill together to develop and design something which is more coherent, nationwide, and which has a long-term perspective to build the resilience of the communities to these different challenges we already mentioned.
In general, humanitarian money is quite expensive, and it doesn't necessarily build back for the longer term. If through this programme we can actually reduce that humanitarian caseload, in the medium term we've saved ourselves money from needing to put so much money into humanitarian interventions.
If you are working in a development field and you are helping building resilience, means you are helping people to help themselves.
The breadth of the Zimbabwe Resilience Building Fund, of having both the building but also what we call the crisis modifier window, I think we will find that in such years as an El Nino year, or even when there's a lesser shock, those two areas harmonising is incredibly important.
We need to rethink about how much water we are using. We have to produce same amount of food or more with half of water. So these are fundamental part of the core element of resilience building.
And I think it is about that merging and that bringing together of the humanitarian paradigm and activities with longer development thinking. And I think that is very relevant for Zimbabwe, especially in the current year, but probably as climate change manifests itself, become more and more relevant.
Now we have begun with a number of development partners, but more players should join, I hope, to take this process forward.
This fund has the aim, the ultimate aim, it will take time to come on stream, but to be able to have a coordinated window for all humanitarian actors, thinkers, researchers, but also those with funding like DFID, to actually make sure that we use all of that best practice in our humanitarian interventions.
Building a resilient nation is a very important part of the overall strategy the countries adopt.
The private sector programs are really showing some excellent results as well, and the agriculture programs, but it's sort of what happens to those people when there are changes and shocks. And so I think that that's why the ZRBF is really relevant for me, and why I certainly have spent a great deal of my time personally working with UNDP, working very closely with the EU to really sort of try and think through that gap that this programme is trying to fill.
You have a country which has unique assets to develop into a green economy. You have challenges, you have short-term challenges, but your medium-term perspective to build a green, progressive economy are overwhelming.
We need to be planning for the future, and we need to be planning not just agricultural systems, but people's entire livelihood systems to be able to adapt to that climate change, which is already sadly manifesting itself in Zimbabwe, and all the data is showing that that is only going to continue.
We work towards a resilience building of society, communities, and the country.
Zimbabwe being at the forefront of resilience thinking means that it will have learning that can go across Africa and hopefully around the world.